My name is Harper Reynolds. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that reward reliability more than visibility. Operations, coordination, the quiet glue that keeps things from falling apart. I'm the person people describe as steady, low drama, easy to trust, the one who listens more than they speak. People tend to underestimate me because I don't announce myself. I don't compete for attention. I don't correct others when they make assumptions about how much I see or how deeply I feel. There's a certain comfort people take in someone who appears calm, agreeable, and emotionally literate. They mistake that calm for softness. They confuse silence with consent. This story isn't about scandal, even though it begins with one. It's not about exposing anyone, and it's not about revenge. There's no shouting, no grand reveal, no cinematic moment where everything explodes at once. What I'm sharing is quieter than that, and I think more honest. I slept with a married man and called it love. I believed his lies, and I paid for his cowardice. That sentence alone makes it easy to decide who I must be. People are very efficient that way. They hear it and sort you into a category before you've finished breathing. This story is about what happens after that sorting, when the blame settles unevenly, when responsibility is quietly outsourced, and when the person who told the truth first is left holding the weight alone. Over the course of this story, I'll take you through who I was to the people around me, how certain small cuts went unnoticed by everyone except me, and how silence, my silence, slowly changed from habit into choice. You'll hear how I learned to document instead of defend, to observe instead of explain, and how clarity arrived not as rage, but as resolve. There is no villain monologue here, no moment where I win in the way stories usually promise. What there is a psychological reversal that happens without anyone realizing it's underway. A shift in leverage that doesn't require cruelty, only patience. And a kind of justice that doesn't humiliate, but simply leaves everyone exactly where their choices put them. I'm not proud of every decision I made. I'm not asking to be absolved. I'm telling this story because honesty is more useful than punishment, and because there are so many people, especially women, who have been taught to absorb blame quietly, while others step away untouched. If you've ever been the person who carried the consequences while someone else disappeared behind a better story, if you've ever been calm on the outside while recalibrating everything on the inside, then maybe this will feel familiar. Before we go any further, can I ask you something gently? Have you ever been judged for the part of the story that was easiest to name, rather than the one that was true? To most people, I was easy to define because I didn't complicate things. At work, I was dependable Harper, the one who remembered deadlines without reminders, the one who smoothed over miscommunications before they turned into meetings. I wasn't the visionary or the fire starter. I was the person who made sure ideas survived contact with reality. People trusted me with details they didn't want to hold themselves. In social spaces, I was the listener, the one person they talked to when they needed to unload. I asked the right questions, nodded at the right moments, and didn't interrupt with my own stories. That made me feel safe with them, neutral, non-threatening, useful. And to him, I was understanding. That was the word he used most often, usually with a kind of relief in his voice, as if my ability to understand made everything lighter for him, as if it were a resource he could draw from endlessly without asking how it was replenished. I met him through mutual friends. He was charismatic in a contained way, not loud, not flashy, but practiced. The kind of man who had learned how to appear sincere without revealing much. When he talked about his life, there were gaps he filled with tone instead of facts. I noticed, but I didn't interrogate them. I had been trained by then to let people tell me who they were at their own pace. He told me he was married early on. Not dramatically, almost apologetically, as if it were an unfortunate technicality rather than a boundary. He spoke about distance, about emotional absence, about living parallel lives under the same roof. He never spoke with anger. That should have mattered more to me than it did. When something began between us, it didn't feel reckless. That's the uncomfortable truth. It felt considered, slow, wrapped in conversations about ethics and timing and how complicated adulthood can be. He didn't frame himself as trapped. He framed himself as careful, and in doing so, he framed me as someone special, someone he trusted with nuance. I was careful too. Or so I told myself. To the outside world, nothing about me suggested I would become this story. I wasn't impulsive. I wasn't lonely in an obvious way. I had friends, stability, a life that looked orderly from a distance. That made it easier for people later to say, she should have known better. And maybe I should have. But here's what people didn't see. I had spent years being the person who absorbed complexity so others wouldn't have to. I was used to holding uncomfortable truths without demanding immediate resolution. Used to trusting that clarity would arrive if I was patient enough. So when he spoke about love in a lowered voice, when he said he had never felt so seen, when he told me he was working toward change, I didn't hear manipulation. I heard uncertainty, and uncertainty is something I knew how to sit with. To him, I was not a risk. I was a buffer. Someone who would listen without panicking. Someone who wouldn't demand ultimatums. Someone who could be trusted not to make noise. And that role, quiet, steady, emotionally literate, was one I had been rehearsing my entire life. What I didn't realize yet was how expensive that role could become once things went wrong. How quickly being understanding could turn into being convenient. How invisibility, once established, is rarely questioned when blame needs somewhere to land. At that point, though, I still believed in shared responsibility. I still believed that adults owned their choices equally. I still believed that truth, once spoken, had weight. I didn't yet understand that stories don't belong to the most honest person. They belong to the one who leaves first. The first time I felt something shift, it was so small I almost dismissed it as mood. We were sitting across from each other in a quiet cafe. One of those places that feels neutral enough to borrow intimacy from. He was talking about a weekend he'd spent with family. That was the phrase he used, not with his wife, just family. It was vague in a way I had come to accept. At some point, he glanced at his phone and turned the screen slightly away from me. The movement was quick, almost unconscious. Then he smiled and continued talking as if nothing had happened. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Not because he hid the phone, he had always done that, but because of how easily he assumed I wouldn't notice. That my attention was a soft blur, not a focused lens. That my presence was emotional, not perceptual. I didn't say anything. I nodded. I listened. I let the moment pass. That was the cut. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't cruelty. It was the realization that he had started editing reality in front of me, not just around me. And he did it with the confidence of someone who believed I would accommodate the edit. After that, there were others. He would cancel plans with careful explanations that sounded rehearsed, always reasonable, always framed as circumstances, never choices. If I hesitated, if I asked a question that lingered half a second too long, he would soften his voice and say, "You know I'd tell you if something was wrong." That sentence did a lot of work. It implied trust while discouraging scrutiny. It positioned doubt as a failure of faith rather than a response to evidence. And I accepted it, because I didn't want to become the kind of person who demanded reassurance on a schedule. Once, we ran into someone he knew while we were out together. The interaction was brief, polite. Afterwards, he laughed it off and said, "I forget sometimes how small this city can feel." But he didn't touch me for the rest of the evening. I told myself he was being cautious, considerate, protective of everyone involved. That explanation allowed me to keep my dignity intact. It allowed me to believe I was part of a thoughtful process, rather than an inconvenient variable. What I didn't say out loud, but did register quietly, was that his caution never cost him anything. It only asked me to compress myself, to lower my visibility, to accept pauses, gaps, and absences without commentary. The people around us never noticed any of this. Why would they? On the surface, nothing was wrong. He was charming, attentive when present, generous with words. If anything, people admired his composure, his ability to handle complexity. And I had already been cast as the calm one. So when I mentioned gently that something felt off, just once, in a private moment, he looked genuinely surprised. Not defensive, just puzzled, as if the idea itself had not occurred to him. "I thought you understood." There it was again. Understanding. That word, pressed into service like a contract I didn't remember signing. I watched myself nod. I watched myself reassure him. I watched myself become the one who smoothed his discomfort instead of examining my own. That night, when I got home, I opened my notebook. Not to write about him, specifically. I told myself it was just a habit, a place to process thoughts. I wrote the date, a few lines about the conversation, the way his tone changed when I asked a question, the way he seemed relieved when I dropped it. It didn't feel strategic at the time. It felt grounding, like anchoring a thought before it drifted away. The cut wasn't deep enough to bleed, but it was precise enough to mark. And once something is marked, you start seeing where the pressure lands again and again. You start noticing patterns, not with alarm, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. I didn't confront him. I didn't pull away. I didn't harden. I stayed exactly the same on the outside. But internally, something subtle shifted. A recalibration. I began to pay attention not just to what he said, but to what his words allowed him to avoid. Not just to his presence, but to the shape of his absences. Everyone else continued as before. They saw what they expected to see. Only I remembered the cut. Disrespect rarely arrives with a warning label. It doesn't announce itself as something unacceptable. It shows up as an adjustment, a compromise, a small recalibration you make to keep things functioning. And the danger is not in the moment itself, but in how quickly your body learns to accommodate it. After that first cut, nothing overtly changed. If anything, things seemed smoother. He was attentive in bursts, long messages filled with reassurance, carefully chosen words about how different this was, how rare the connection felt. He spoke about timing as if it were a third person in the relationship, something outside his control that would eventually resolve itself. I learned the rhythm. When he pulled away, I leaned back emotionally. When he leaned in, I stayed steady. I told myself this was maturity, that this was how adults navigated complicated realities without making everything dramatic. The cancellations became predictable, always with context, always with regret. He never dismissed me outright. He just deprioritized me with elegance. And I thanked him for being honest, even when honesty arrived late. What I didn't realize was how often I was doing the emotional labor for both of us. When he felt guilty, I reassured him. When he felt conflicted, I reframed it as growth. When he went quiet, I filled the silence with understanding instead of questions. It felt generous. It felt kind. It also slowly trained him to expect that my needs would arrive pre-diluted. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when I realized this had become normal. We had planned to spend an evening together. Nothing elaborate. Just time. At the last minute, he texted to say something had come up. He added a line about how disappointed he was, how much he'd been looking forward to it. I stared at the message longer than usual. Then I typed, "I understand. Of course, take care of what you need to." And as I sent it, I felt a flicker of something I didn't have a name for yet. Not anger, not sadness, resignation. Not because the plan was cancelled, but because I knew, without asking, that there would be no attempt to reschedule. No question about when I was free. The moment would simply dissolve, and I would be expected to absorb the loss quietly. Which I did. The next time we saw each other, he acted as if nothing had been missed. He was warm, present, curious about my life in an abstract way. People are when they want credit for caring without engaging too deeply. I noticed that when I spoke about my own work, my own pressures, he listened politely, but didn't ask follow-up questions. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't need to. My life existed to support his narrative, not complicate it. And I allowed that, because I had learned, long before him, that asking for space can feel like asking for too much. Everyone around us continued to admire his restraint, his ability to balance things. If anyone noticed that I had become quieter, they attributed it to my personality. I had always been the composed one, the one who didn't make waves. So when I began to feel small, I assumed it was a personal failure, a lack of resilience. I told myself I was being sensitive, that I was misreading the situation. That's how normalization works. You don't wake up one day and decide to accept less. You slowly recalibrate your expectations until disappointment feels familiar enough to ignore. I stopped initiating certain conversations, stopped suggesting plans that required commitment. I learned which topics made him uncomfortable and navigated around them. Not consciously at first, it felt intuitive, almost loving. But love that requires constant self-editing leaves residue. At night, I would open my notebook and write a few lines. Nothing accusatory, just observations, dates, phrases he used repeatedly, the way he framed responsibility, The way his version of events always left him morally intact. I told myself it was for clarity, that writing helped me sort my thoughts. And it did. What it also did, quietly, without my full awareness, was preserve a version of reality that wasn't being negotiated away in real time. A record that didn't soften itself to protect anyone's comfort. I still didn't think of myself as someone being disrespected. That word felt too harsh, too dramatic. Disrespect was loud, obvious. This was subtle, civilized. But something in me had started to understand that civility can coexist with erasure, and that once you accept being easy to overlook, people stop checking whether you're still there. Roles are rarely announced. They emerge through repetition. By the time I recognized the role I had been assigned, I was already performing it well. Too well. I was the reliable constant in a situation built on uncertainty. The one who didn't demand clarity on a timeline. The one who absorbed complexity without flinching. The one who could be counted on not to make things harder. I was useful. That usefulness showed up in quiet ways. I was the person he processed guilt with. The one he spoke to when the weight of his choices pressed in, when the contradictions of his life became briefly uncomfortable. I listened. I reflected. I helped him articulate feelings he didn't have space to explore anywhere else. And then he would leave, emotionally or physically, and return to the life that required the least disruption. I didn't ask to be central. I didn't ask to be chosen. I told myself I was being realistic, that I was participating in something complicated with eyes open. But roles don't stay neutral. Mine came with expectations I hadn't agreed to explicitly, that I would be patient indefinitely, that I would self-regulate any discomfort privately, that I would not introduce needs that required structural change. When he spoke about the future, it was always conditional. If things change, when the timing is right, eventually. Those words floated just far enough away to avoid becoming promises, and I nodded, because pressing for definition would have broken the illusion of equilibrium. The truth is, I had been cast as the emotional holding room, the place where tension could be released without consequence, where honesty could be partial and still receive validation. I saw it most clearly the day he confided in me about an argument at home. He spoke at length about feeling misunderstood, about how hard it was to carry everything alone. I listened, as I always did. At one point he paused and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." It sounded like gratitude. It wasn't. It was confirmation. Confirmation that my role was not to change his circumstances, but to make them bearable. That my presence functioned as pressure relief, not direction. I didn't respond immediately. I felt something settle in my chest. Not pain exactly, but weight. The weight of realizing that I existed in his life as a stabilizer, not a catalyst. And still I stayed composed, because composure had always been rewarded. Because emotional restraint had become my currency, because being the strong one meant the not requirement. The people around us reinforced this without knowing it. Friends would comment on how chill I was, how understanding, how I seemed to handle things with such grace. No one asked what handling actually cost me, and I didn't volunteer the answer. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being perceived as endlessly capable. It means no one checks to see if you're overextended. No one questions whether you're being asked to carry more than your share. I began to see how often decisions were made without my input. Decisions that affected me. Plans adjusted. Narratives shaped. I was informed after the fact, always with a tone of apology that implied inevitability. I recognized the pattern from other parts of my life. From workplaces where I was dependent but rarely promoted. From friendships where I was leaned on but not prioritized. I had always been the one who made things work quietly. This was just another version of that. The difference was that this time, the cost was emotional intimacy. And intimacy, once commodified, is hard to reclaim. I didn't confront him about the role, not yet. Confrontation would have required him to see it, and seeing it would have required change. I wasn't ready to ask for that, because I wasn't sure what I would do if he said no. So instead, I did what I had always done, I observed. I listened not just for what he said, but for what my presence allowed him to avoid. I noted how often my understanding was used to defer action. I paid attention to how rarely my needs entered the equation, unless I introduced them carefully. The role was clear now. Reliable, useful, invisible when inconvenient. And once you can name a role, you can decide whether to continue playing it. I just hadn't made that decision yet. The shift didn't come with a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic discovery that shattered the illusion in one clean break. It came on an ordinary afternoon. I was alone, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, half working, half staring out the window. Rain had started without my noticing. The kind of soft, persistent rain that turns the world quieter instead of darker. He had texted earlier that day. Something brief, affectionate in tone, non-committal in content. A check-in that asked how I was doing without creating space for a real answer. I typed a reply and then deleted it. Typed again, deleted again. That's when I noticed how automatic my responses had become. How quickly my mind moved to reassurance before even considering honesty. How efficiently I edited myself to maintain equilibrium. I closed the messaging app without sending anything. That was new. Not defiant, not emotional, just deliberate. I opened my notebook instead. I didn't write about him right away. I wrote about myself. About the way my chest felt tight when I anticipated his silences. About the mental math I did before every interaction. About how much of my emotional energy was being spent on maintenance rather than connection. And then I wrote a sentence that surprised me. I am not confused. I am simply not being prioritized. Seeing it on the page was different than thinking it. It stripped the situation of its complexity. It didn't accuse. It didn't dramatize. It is just named the dynamic. I sat with that for a long time. Later that evening, he called. His voice was warm, familiar. He talked about his day, about stress, about how good it felt to hear my voice. I listened. I responded appropriately. But I didn't offer comfort preemptively. At one point, he paused and said, "You're quiet tonight." I let the silence stretch just a little longer than usual. Not to punish him, to see what would happen. Just thinking, I said. He accepted that easily. That's when I realized how much my emotional presence had been filling gaps he didn't even notice. How accustomed he had become to my availability as a stabilizing force. How little he asked about the parts of me that weren't oriented toward him. After we hung up, I didn't feel the usual mix of closeness and depletion. I felt clear. Clarity is unsettling when you're used to ambiguity. It removes the comfort of hoping things will change on their own. It places responsibility back where it belongs. Over the next few days, nothing outwardly changed. I still responded, I still listened, I still showed up when we spoke. But internally, something had crossed a threshold. I stopped framing his behavior as confusion and started seeing it as a choice. Not a malicious choice, not calculated cruelty, just a preference reinforced by convenience. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. I noticed how rarely he asked what I needed. How often future talk evaporated when it approached specificity. How easily he accepted my understanding without reciprocating it. This wasn't new information. What was new was my refusal to translate it into self-blame. That afternoon at the table hadn't made me angry. It had made me still. And stillness, I was learning, can be more dangerous to the status quo than emotion. I didn't announce the shift. I didn't confront him with realizations he hadn't asked for. I didn't demand change. I simply stopped compensating. And that quiet withdrawal, of emotional labor, of reassurance, of unspoken flexibility, created a space neither of us had experienced before. He felt it, even if he didn't know how to name it. I felt it as relief, not because I had decided to leave, not because I had chosen an outcome, but because, for the first time, I was no longer negotiating reality in my own head to make the situation bearable. I was letting it be what it was. And that changed everything. Silence had always been my default. It was how I avoided unnecessary conflict, how I gave people room to reveal themselves, how I protected my energy. For most of my life, it had been instinctive rather than intentional. Now it has become a choice. I didn't announce that choice. I didn't say, I'm pulling back, or I'm done doing the emotional work. I simply stopped filling the space the way I used to. When he went quiet, I didn't rush in with reassurance. When he cancelled plans, I acknowledged it without softening the disappointment for him. When he talked about stress, I listened, but I didn't resolve it on his behalf. The change was subtle enough that he couldn't point to it, but consistent enough that he felt it. At first, he mistook it for mood. "You seem tired lately," he said once gently. "I am," I replied, and I left it there. He offered sympathy, then moved on. He didn't ask what I was tired of. That told me more than any argument could have. My silence wasn't cold. It wasn't passive-aggressive. It was clean. Observational. I was still present, but I was no longer cushioning his experience. I let pauses exist. I let his discomfort stay his. And something interesting happened. He started talking more, explaining himself without being prompted, filling the space that I used to hold open for him. He would justify delays, clarify intentions, and circle back to things I hadn't asked about. It was as if the absence of my emotional labor made him aware of its former weight. Still, he didn't change his behavior, he just narrated it more. From the outside, nothing looked different. We hadn't had a fight. There was no dramatic shift in tone. Friends would have said we were the same as always, close, thoughtful, restrained. But inside I had repositioned myself. I was no longer waiting for things to resolve. I was watching how they maintained themselves. I noticed how often his explanations centered on his constraints, his confusion, his fear of disruption. I noticed how rarely he spoke about impact, about what his choices required from me. I also noticed something else, how easy it was for him to believe my silence meant everything was fine. People who benefit from your understanding rarely check whether it's still being offered willingly. There was a moment when he asked, almost casually, "You're okay with how things are, right?" I didn't answer immediately. "I'm okay with what I'm choosing," I said finally. He paused, not long, just enough to register the difference. "Right," he said, "of course." He didn't ask what that meant. That's the thing about silence when it's chosen. It doesn't demand interpretation. It simply exists, and people project onto it what they need to believe. He believed my quiet meant patience, that I was waiting, that I was still aligned with his pace. I let him believe that, not because I wanted to deceive him, but because I was done correcting narratives that protected him from responsibility. If he wanted clarity, he could ask for it. He didn't. Instead, he continued as before, assuming the structure would hold, assuming my presence was a constant rather than a choice renewed daily. Meanwhile, I was paying attention. I noticed how often he referenced his marriage as something static, unchangeable, how responsibility dissolved into abstraction, how my understanding allowed him to postpone decisions indefinitely. Silence gave me space to see all of this without the distortion of hope. It also gave me back energy I hadn't realized I was spending. I slept better. I thought more clearly. I stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened. The mental noise faded, replaced by something steadier. Preparation, not in the sense of plotting, in the sense of orienting myself toward reality instead of possibility. I didn't know yet what I would do. I hadn't decided on an outcome, but I had decided something fundamental. I would no longer protect him from the consequences of his own inaction. And silence, quiet, composed, intentional, was the first tool that allowed that decision to take shape. When people think of preparation, they imagine movement, activity, a visible shift in behavior that signals something is coming. What they never notice is the preparation that looks like stillness. From the outside, my life appeared unchanged. I went to work. I met friends. I answered messages in the same calm tone I always had. I didn't withdraw socially. I didn't broadcast dissatisfaction. I didn't rewrite my personality to signal discontent. That was the mistake everyone made. They assumed consistency meant compliance. Internally, though, I had begun to observe with a different posture. Not as someone invested in preserving the relationship at all costs, but as someone documenting reality without emotional interference. I started noticing patterns I had previously smoothed over. How often he reached out only when his internal world felt unstable. How rarely he checked in when things were going well. How my presence functioned less as a connection and more as a containment. I noted timing, frequency, language, not obsessively, not with bitterness, just accurately. When he said, "I don't want to hurt anyone," I paid attention to who was already being hurt and who wasn't included in that category. When he spoke about fear, I noticed how fear always excused delay, but never demanded sacrifice from him. I began to understand that his greatest skill wasn't deception. It was a deferral. He postponed accountability by framing it as thoughtfulness. He delayed decisions by calling them complex. And because I had once validated that framing, he trusted it would continue to work. He didn't see that I had stopped reinforcing it. My notebook changed during this time. Early entries had been emotional processing, trying to understand how I felt, why certain moments landed the way they did. Now, the entries were cleaner, more factual. Dates, quotes, actions followed by outcomes. Not because I planned to use them against him, but because I was done gaslighting myself. There's something powerful about writing down the exact words someone uses when they think no one is keeping track. About seeing how often phrases repeat, how explanations loop, how nothing actually progresses. I also began to pay attention to my own capacity, what it felt like to say less, to resist the urge to clarify, to reassure, to smooth, how much emotional energy was freed up, how that energy naturally redirected itself, not toward resentment, but toward competence. I became sharper at work, more decisive, less apologetic about boundaries I had always had but rarely enforced. People noticed, but they interpreted it as confidence, not withdrawal. No one asks questions when you grow quieter and more capable at the same time. Even he noticed, just not accurately. "You seem really grounded lately," he said once. "It's good to see." I smiled when he said that, because grounding looks like stability to people who benefit from it. They don't realize it can also be the moment someone plants their feet before stepping away. During this period, I stopped sharing future-oriented thoughts with him. Not out of secrecy, out of relevance. My future no longer required his input, so I didn't seek it. I also stopped asking questions that invited him to imagine change. I let his present actions speak without interpretation. What he never noticed was how much I was learning by doing that. Learning how systems maintain themselves, how people rely on others to absorb consequences quietly, how silence, when no longer compensatory, becomes revealing. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation. I wasn't rehearsing speeches. I wasn't waiting for the right moment to demand clarity. I was preparing myself to act without needing permission. That's the part no one sees. They think power announces itself, that it escalates, that it demands attention. But real leverage is often built in private, through patience, observation, and the refusal to continue carrying what isn't yours. By the time he sensed something was different, it was already too late to restore the version of me that made things easier for him. And he never even knew when that version disappeared. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It came as confirmation. By then, I wasn't searching for answers. I was verifying what I already suspected. That distinction matters, because searching is fueled by hope, and verification is guided by clarity. The moment came quietly, folded into an otherwise ordinary exchange. He had been distant for a few days, not unreachable, just selectively present. Short replies, delayed responses, a familiar pattern I no longer translated on his behalf. When we finally spoke, he sounded relieved, as if my voice stabilized something that had been wobbling. He talked, I listened. At one point, he said something small, almost throwaway, a detail about a conversation at home. The timing didn't align with what he had told me earlier that week. Not dramatically, just enough to create a seam. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't correct him. I asked a neutral question instead. "Remind me, was that before or after you said you'd be out of town?" There was a pause. Fractional, barely noticeable. "Oh, after," he said, adjusting smoothly. Too smoothly. That was it. Not because of the inconsistency itself, but because of how easily it slid into place. How practiced the correction sounded. How confident was he that I would accept it without cross-referencing? And I realized then that I wasn't inside a complicated love story. I was inside a well-managed narrative, one where details were flexible, responsibility was diffuse, and accountability could always be postponed by emotional language. A narrative that worked because I had once participated in maintaining it. I didn't feel anger. I felt something closer to relief, because the question I had been circling for months, "Am I misreading this?" finally dissolved. There was nothing to reinterpret, nothing to excuse. The structure was visible now. That night, I opened my notebook and laid everything out. Not dramatically, methodically. Dates, statements, changes. The way certain truths only emerged under pressure, and how quickly they were reshaped. The pattern wasn't malicious, it was self-protective, and that made it more reliable, not less. I saw how often I had been positioned as the only person expected to absorb the moral cost of the situation. How his fear of hurting others translated into my responsibility to stay quiet. How my discretion had become the scaffolding that kept everything standing. The private reveal wasn't about discovering betrayal. It was about discovering leverage. Not leverage over him, but over myself. I finally understood that I didn't need him to confess anything. I didn't need proof that would satisfy an external audience. I didn't need a moment where the truth was acknowledged aloud. I needed alignment between what I knew and how I acted. That alignment was the point of no return. Because once you see how a system functions, you can't go back to pretending it's accidental. You can choose to stay, but you do so with eyes open, fully complicit in the outcome. And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. There was no urge to confront him, no desire to expose the contradictions. That would have required me to re-enter the role of emotional regulator, guiding him through discomfort toward a resolution that preserved his stability. I was done with that role. Instead, I sat with clarity. I let it settle into my body. I noticed how much lighter it felt not to negotiate reality internally. The reveal stayed private because it needed to. Power doesn't need witnesses when it's internal. It doesn't need validation when it's rooted in self-trust. He sensed a change after that. I could tell by the way he asked questions that didn't quite land, by the subtle increase in attention, the vague references to us that arrived too late to feel meaningful. He was responding to a shift he couldn't see, and I wasn't cruel enough or invested enough to explain it to him. The truth was no longer something I needed him to acknowledge. It was something I was finally willing to act on. There's a moment, once clarity arrives, where you're forced to choose, not between right and wrong, but between comfort and consequence. For a while, I stayed in that in-between space. Not because I was unsure of what I knew, but because I was weighing what each option would cost me. I could stay. Staying would mean continuing exactly as things were, but now with full awareness. It would mean accepting my role consciously, understanding that nothing structural would change unless I forced it. It would mean choosing proximity over integrity, familiarity over alignment. I could confront him. That option was seductive in its promise of release. To lay everything out, to name the patterns, to demand accountability. But I knew how that story went. He would apologize, he would explain, he would express pain and confusion and gratitude for my honesty. And then, eventually, things would settle back into a slightly adjusted version of the same dynamic. Confrontation would have centered him, his feelings, his processing, his timeline. And then there was the third option, the one that didn't involve negotiation, the irreversible one. I didn't decide in a rush. I let the clarity sit with me for days. I paid attention to how my body responded when I imagined each path. Staying made me feel tight, smaller, like folding myself back into a shape I had outgrown. Confronting made me feel tired, as if I were volunteering for more labor under the illusion of progress. The third option, quiet withdrawal, paired with decisive action, felt steady. Not easy, but clean. It didn't require him to understand or agree. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't hinge on his capacity for change. It required only my follow-through. That was the decision point. Not what would he do, but what would I stop doing? I decided I would no longer participate in a relationship that required my silence to function while offering me no real agency. I would no longer protect a narrative that asked me to absorb all the moral weight. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't frame it as an ending. Not yet. Instead, I began to act in ways that assumed the outcome without declaring it. I stopped being available on demand. I stopped rearranging my schedule to accommodate uncertainty. I stopped responding immediately to messages designed to check my emotional temperature rather than engage meaningfully. I also started redirecting my energy. I revisited goals I had set aside. I strengthened professional connections. I made decisions about my life that did not account for his presence or absence. These weren't dramatic moves. They were structural, and that's what made them irreversible. Once you build a life that doesn't require someone to remain ambiguous, ambiguity loses its power. He noticed the change, of course. He asked questions, tentative ones. He referenced how things felt different lately. He suggested we spend more time together, still without specifics. I didn't argue, I didn't accuse. I simply didn't reorganize my life to accommodate half steps. The decision wasn't about punishing him. It was about no longer punishing myself by waiting for someone else's readiness. I understood then that quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about refusing to outsource your future to someone who benefits from delay. That decision didn't bring immediate relief. There was grief in it, a mourning of the version of the story I had once believed in, a letting go of potential that would never be realized. But beneath that grief was something solid, self-respect. And once that settles in, it's very hard to talk yourself out of it. When people imagine endings, They picture scenes, final conversations, declarations, visible shifts that mark before and after. What they don't picture is the quiet administrative work of disentangling a life from someone else's gravity. That's what I was doing now. Moving in silence didn't mean disappearing. It meant acting without narration, without explanation, without inviting interpretation. I began with the practical. I adjusted my routines so they no longer revolved around availability. I committed to plans that had nothing to do with him. I protected my time the way I once protected his feelings. At work, I accepted an opportunity I had previously hesitated over because it would have complicated our already limited time together. I didn't tell him about it right away, not out of secrecy, but because his reaction no longer factored into my decision-making. I also started disentangling emotionally. When he reached out during moments of stress, I responded kindly but briefly. I didn't step into the familiar role of stabilizer. I didn't ask probing questions. I didn't offer interpretations that softened his guilt. The effect was subtle but immediate. He had fewer places to put his discomfort. He began to escalate, not with demands, but with presence. More frequent messages, casual mentions of missing me, vague references to figuring things out. Still no specifics, still no action. I watched without reacting. Moving in silence gave me space to see how much of our connection had been sustained by my responsiveness. Without it, the structure wobbled, not catastrophically, just enough to reveal its fragility. There were moments when he almost said something real, when his words circled the edges of accountability. But each time, he retreated into abstraction before committing to change. And each time I let him, not because I was hoping he would fail, but because I was done rescuing him from the consequences of his hesitation. I also made a conscious decision not to involve anyone else. I didn't vent to mutual friends. I didn't seek validation for my choice. I didn't need a chorus to confirm what I already knew. Silence protected my clarity. It kept the process clean, uncontaminated by outside opinions that would have pulled me back into explanation, justification, and defense. There's a particular strength in acting without witnesses. It forces you to be honest with yourself because there's no audience to perform for. He sensed that something was happening. I could feel it in the way his questions sharpened. "Are you pulling away?" he asked once, trying to sound casual. "No," I said, which was true. I wasn't pulling away, I was repositioning. He didn't press. People rarely do when the truth would require them to act. As weeks passed, the imbalance became more visible, not to others, but to him. He started experiencing an absence where there had once been accommodation, silence where there had once been reassurance. And he didn't like it, but he still didn't change. That was the final confirmation I needed. Because when someone senses loss and still chooses inaction, they are telling you exactly where you stand. I didn't feel triumphant about that realization. I felt steady. Moving in silence isn't about waiting for the other person to notice. It's about ensuring that when they do, it no longer matters. Consequences rarely arrive with an announcement. They don't knock. They don't explain themselves. They simply begin to rearrange the emotional landscape, and the people who benefited from the old arrangement feel the shift before they understand it. He felt it first as absence, not the obvious kind, the kind that comes with silence or disappearance, but the quieter kind, the absence of emotional buffering, of reassurance offered before it was asked for. I have an instinctive ability to anticipate what he needed and supply it without friction. At first, he interpreted it as stress. He asked if I was overwhelmed, if work was demanding more of me lately. He framed the change as circumstantial because that explanation allowed him to remain passive. I didn't correct him. Soon, the absence turned into an inconvenience. He reached out during a particularly difficult moment. One of those times when his internal conflicts spilled over and he needed someone to talk him back into equilibrium. I listened, as I still did, but I didn't stay late on the phone. I didn't cancel plans to hold space. I didn't follow up the next day to check if he was okay. I trusted that he could manage the feelings he had always managed, just without outsourcing the processing to me. That was new for him. He started to feel the loss in practical ways, the lack of emotional continuity, the way his stress lingered instead of dissolving, the way uncertainty sat with him longer than he was used to. Still, he didn't name it. People often sense consequences long before they connect them to the cause. I saw the confusion surface in small ways. He would repeat questions I had already answered. He would reference moments of closeness from the past, as if reminding me, or himself, that they existed. Remember when we talked for hours about everything? He said once, lightly. I do, I replied. And I let the memory stand on its own, without nostalgia, without invitation. That's when the anxiety crept in. He became more attentive, but not more accountable. His messages increased in frequency, but not in depth. He expressed missing me, but not choosing me. Loss, when it arrives without clarity, creates panic. And panic seeks restoration, not transformation. He wanted the feeling back. He wasn't prepared to change the structure that produced it. The consequences also began to show up in how he spoke. Less confidence, more circling. He asked questions that were really tests, gauges to see if I was still there in the same way. I wasn't, and that realization unsettled him. What he didn't understand was that the loss he was experiencing wasn't caused by my withdrawal. It was caused by his reliance on something he had never secured. You can't lose what you were never willing to claim. From the outside, nothing dramatic was happening. There was no fallout, no exposure, no visible collapse. Friends would have seen the same man, living the same life, moving through the same routines. But internally, something was destabilizing. The quiet certainty that he had me, my understanding, my patience, my silence, had evaporated. And without that certainty, the rest of his choices felt heavier. I felt the consequences too, not as guilt, but as grief. There were moments when I missed the version of myself that could make things feel easy, the version that found meaning in being needed. But I also felt something else, relief, because for the first time, the imbalance was no longer invisible. It was being experienced by the person who had benefited from it. And I hadn't had to raise my voice or demand recognition to make that happen. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, but as exposure. Exposure to reality. Panic doesn't announce itself as panic. It masquerades as urgency, as a sudden insight, as the realization that something important is slipping away. By the time he reached that stage, the structure was already unsalvageable. It began with attempts at repair that arrived without understanding. He suggested spending more time together, still without defining when or how. He spoke about wanting to do better, about being in a period of reflection. He asked questions that sounded like progress but landed like placeholders. What do you need right now? He asked once. It was the first time he had asked that directly. I paused before answering, not because I didn't know, but because I was aware of the weight of the moment. This was the point where many stories turn back on themselves, where a little hope is enough to reset the cycle. I need alignment, I said calmly. He nodded, even though the word didn't give him anything concrete to act on. Alignment requires structure. It requires decisions. It requires consequences. He offered reassurance instead. I care about you, he said, but you know that. I did know. That wasn't the issue. Caring had never been the problem. Action had. The panic sharpened after that. He began to reach out more frequently, checking in under the guise of concern. He referenced the past again, this time with more emotion. He spoke about regret. Not about specific choices, but about the feeling of distance itself. Distance is easier to mourn than responsibility. I listened without correcting him. There's a moment when someone realizes they've waited too long, where they scramble to restore what existed before they fully understand why it mattered. They want the feeling back without doing the work that sustains it. That's where he was. He suggested we talk, really talk. He framed it as an opportunity to clear the air, to reset, to reconnect. I agreed to meet, not because I believed it would fix anything, but because I wanted to close the loop cleanly. We met in a quiet place, neutral, public enough to keep things contained. He looked tired, not dramatically so, just worn around the edges in a way that comes from prolonged internal conflict. He talked first, about fear, about being overwhelmed, about how much he valued me, about how he hadn't realized how much I did until it wasn't there in the same way. That was the closest he came to naming the truth. When it was my turn, I didn't list grievances. I didn't present evidence. I didn't argue with his feelings. I spoke simply. I told him that I had spent a long time being understanding, and that in doing so, I had slowly stepped out of alignment with myself. I told him that I no longer wanted a connection that depended on my silence to function, that I wasn't angry, but I was done. He looked startled, not by the words, but by the tone. There was no heat in it, no desperation, no invitation to negotiate. He tried then to offer what he thought I wanted. More presence, more effort, vague commitments to change. But the timing betrayed him. These were the words that came after loss was felt, not before responsibility was taken. They were reactive, not grounded. And I knew, without doubt, that even if he followed through temporarily, the structure would remain unchanged. That I would eventually be asked, again, to carry the uncertainty quietly. I wasn't willing to do that anymore, so I declined. Not harshly, not dramatically. I thanked him for the honesty he was offering now. I told him I believed he meant it. And I told him it was too late. Not as punishment, as a fact. Because repair requires willingness before rupture, not after. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply went still. That's when I saw it. The moment when someone understands that the version of the story they relied on no longer exists. We parted without spectacle. No final declarations, no promises to stay in touch. Just a quiet ending that reflected the quiet way the damage had been done. I walked away feeling heavier in one sense. Grief always weighs something, but lighter in another. Because I knew, with absolute clarity, that I hadn't left because he failed to change. I had left because I finally had. People expect confrontation to be loud, to crack open the room, to carry the heat of all the words that were swallowed along the way. What they don't expect is how quiet it can be when nothing is left to prove. By the time we spoke again, our final real conversation, I wasn't carrying a list. I wasn't braced for impact. I wasn't trying to win an argument or secure an admission. The confrontation, if it could even be called that, had already happened internally. This was just the alignment catching up to language. He reached out a few days after we parted. Not urgently, carefully, as if testing the temperature of the space between us. "Can we talk for a few minutes?" I agreed. When we spoke, his voice held a restraint I hadn't heard before. Less confident, more measured. He wasn't trying to charm or persuade. He was trying to understand where the ground had gone. "I keep thinking about what you said," he began. "About silence, about alignment." I let him continue. He spoke about regret again, this time more specifically, about how he hadn't realized how much he had leaned on me, about how safe he felt with me, and how he took that safety for granted, about how he thought he had more time. Time again, the stand-in for accountability. When he finished, there was a pause that would once have pulled me forward, into reassurance, into explanation, into softening the edges of his discomfort. I didn't move. "I believe you," I said finally, "and I don't doubt that you cared." That seemed to surprise him. "But caring," I continued, "was never the issue. What mattered was what caring allowed you to delay." He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He just listened. I told him, calmly, that I had spent a long time making myself smaller so the situation could stay manageable. That I had confused patience with partnership and understanding with consent. That I no longer wanted a relationship where my needs had to arrive quietly to be acceptable. There was no accusation in it. No sharpness, just clarity. He asked if there was anything he could do now. It was an honest question. Too late, but honest. "No," I said. "Not because you're incapable, because the version of me who would wait for that no longer exists." That was the hardest part for him to hear. Not that he had done something wrong, but that the impact had already reshaped me. People can apologize for actions. They struggle to accept that time changes the terms. He nodded slowly. I could hear him processing, not scrambling this time, but absorbing. The conversation didn't drag. There were no circular arguments, no attempts to reopen doors. When we ended the call, it felt complete. Not satisfying in the way movies promise, but resolved. Confrontation without heat leaves very little to argue with. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't humiliate. It simply states reality and lets it stand. I didn't walk away feeling victorious. I walked away feeling intact, because I hadn't needed him to understand everything. I hadn't needed agreement or absolution. I had spoken from a place that didn't require validation to hold its shape. That's what quiet dominance looks like in real life. Not control, not exposure, just the refusal to abandon yourself again. After something ends cleanly, there's often an assumption that what comes next is relief. Lightness, a return to equilibrium. What I felt instead was spaciousness, not emptiness, space. A room where something else could exist without having to negotiate for it. For a while, I didn't rush to fill that space. I let it remain open. I paid attention to how my days felt without the low-level vigilance that had once accompanied every interaction. How my thoughts moved without looping back to someone else's needs. How my energy, once reclaimed, redistributed itself naturally. I noticed that I laughed more easily, that my patience felt less brittle, that silence, real silence, not the kind that carries unspoken tension, had returned to my life. I also noticed how much I had been performing composure, not faking it, but over-relying on it. Using calm as a way to stay acceptable, to avoid being inconvenient, to keep relationships smooth, even when they cost me something. Now my calm came from alignment, not suppression. I didn't become louder. I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't turn into someone unrecognizable. I simply became more precise. I say no faster now. Not harshly, just without apology. I ask questions when something doesn't make sense, and I don't soften them to protect someone else's comfort. I don't fill silences that aren't mine to manage. People respond differently to me now. Some with respect, some with distance. Both are informative. What I don't feel anymore is the need to be endlessly understood. That's a subtle but profound shift. I no longer mistake being chosen for being valued. I no longer equate patience with virtue. I no longer believe that carrying complexity quietly is proof of maturity. Maturity, I've learned, is knowing when understanding becomes self-erasure. There are still moments when I think about him, not with longing and not with resentment, just with acknowledgement. He was part of my life during a time when I was still learning the cost of my own silence. I don't wish him harm. I don't fantasize about him realizing what he lost. That kind of closure centers someone who no longer belongs at the center of my story. The justice in this story isn't dramatic. It's structural. I stopped being available for dynamics that required my diminishment. And as a result, those dynamics lost their power over me. That's it. No grand ending, no moral triumph. Just a life that no longer bends itself around someone else's indecision. If there's one thing that defines who I am now, it's this. I trust my clarity more than I trust potential. Potential is seductive. It asks you to invest without guarantees. Clarity asks you to respond to what's actually happening. And I choose clarity. There's a particular kind of story people expect when they hear about situations like this. They expect a lesson wrapped in punishment, a clear winner, a villain exposed. They expect pain to be repaid with spectacle. This story doesn't offer that. What it offers instead is something quieter and harder to dismiss. No one was publicly shamed. No secrets were weaponized. No reputations were destroyed. And yet nothing was left unresolved. Because the truth is, the most lasting consequences don't come from being caught. They come from being seen clearly and realizing too late that what sustained you is no longer available. I didn't win by taking something from him. I won by stopping myself from giving what was costing me my alignment. That's the moral most people miss. When you carry blame alone, when you absorb complexity quietly, when you make yourself endlessly reasonable so others don't have to change, you teach people how to treat you, and they will follow that lesson faithfully until you stop teaching it. Quiet dominance isn't about power over others, it's about power over yourself. It's the moment you realize you don't need permission to exit dynamics that rely on your silence. You don't need agreement to choose yourself. You don't need vindication to be done. And maybe most importantly, you don't need to be angry to leave. I believed his lies and I paid for his cowardice, but I also learned something invaluable in that payment. I learned that love without accountability is just emotional labor with a prettier name. I learned that patience, when it's one-sided, is not a virtue. It's a delay of the inevitable. And I learned that clarity once earned is not something you owe anyone an explanation for. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, if you've been the calm one, the understanding one, the one who handles things well while quietly eroding, know this. You are not weak for staying as long as you did. You are not foolish for believing someone's words, and you are not cruel for leaving when alignment finally arrives. Sometimes the most just ending is simply refusing to continue. I'm not sharing this, so you'll take sides. I'm sharing it so you'll recognize the moment when silence stops being protection and starts being self-erasure. And maybe, if you're standing at that edge right now, you'll trust yourself enough to step back without needing a push. So I'll leave you with this question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized that staying quiet was costing you more than leaving ever could?